Good afternoon. My name is Scott Hicks. I'm director of the Teaching and Learning Center, and thank you for joining us for the 2021 celebration of teaching and learning at UNC Pembroke. I'm joined today by Dr. Jane Haladay, professor of American Indian Studies at UNCP. Jane, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome, Dr. Hicks. I'm happy to be here.
Our first question is this: who was the best teacher you ever had and why?
I have to say, in thinking about this question, I could not think of the best. I've been very privileged to have a lot of wonderful educators, both in K-12 and in college, and I appreciate them all. The person I'm going to tell you about, though, is Mr. Patrick Conroy. He was my 7th and 8th grade Spanish teacher at Henry E. Huntington Junior High School. That's what we called middle school in California. That was in San Marino, California. And he is memorable to me for a number of reasons. I love speaking Spanish. I grew up, in Southern California, hearing a lot of Spanish, but that's not my heritage, and I didn't speak it, as a native person, of course, as a native speaker. But Mr. Conroy, who was this, he must have been in his 30s. You know how it is when you're younger, you think everybody's kind of old, but he didn't seem that old. But he was this jolly white man with kind of a balding hair and a mustache, and he just seemed happy all the time, and he loved Spanish. I don't think he had Spanish heritage. I know nothing about his backstory in terms of how he came to the teaching of Spanish, but he made learning Spanish fun. And you could tell that he was always happy to be with his students. He was happy to be teaching his subject. He at one point found out that I could draw, or that I liked to draw, and so he asked me to draw these little scenes related to the vocabulary that we would be learning in class for that week on our handouts, which in those ancient days were those mimeographed handouts that you like cranked out, with purple ink on a machine. So I was so thrilled to have been asked to draw these little scenes. I'm sure they were completely stereotypical now, when I look back, but I'm not going to go into that too deeply. But anyway, so he brought this kind of joy to the learning of Spanish. He took us on a field trip one time, I remember, to see the Ramona pageant in Hemet, California, which is a big deal. And it's kind of a historical reenactment about a California native person. And that was really exciting to be doing something outside of class with Mr. Conroy. And not a lot of my teachers at that time were taking us places. So that was really fun. I remember I remember him teaching us a joke in Spanish, and I still remember the punchline of that joke in Spanish. It was very clever, and I'm going to give you the short version of it, but it was basically about a Spanish-speaking man who went into a clothing store looking for socks, and he could only speak Spanish, and the clerk could only speak English. And so there was this struggle for this man to describe, or you have to suspend your disbelief for this, because I mean, he could have just I think back, I was like, he could have just pointed to his feet, right? But anyhow, it's a joke. You just go along with it. So, the clerk was like pointing to hats, and the man's like, no, 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 pointing to shirts. No, 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 no. And finally the clerk picks up a pair of socks, and the Spanish speaker says, eso sí que es, which in Spanish means, that's it. Yes, that's it. You've got it. But of course, it also sounds like the letters SOCKS. And so then the English speaking clerk says, why didn't you just spell it in the first place? I remember this joke from 7th grade. So that gives you some indication of how memorable Mr. Conroy was to me as a teacher. And then the last thing I just want to add about him is he he supported me and encouraged me beyond 8th grade. I had him for 2 years, and then I went to high school. And I'm not a person with a lot of regrets about my life. I tend to think things happen for a reason, and one path not taken is is another path that you do take. But Mr. Conroy really encouraged me to do a study abroad year in Spain, and he would have supported me to get there. He would have done, whatever one needed to do to see that through back then. And I was just too scared. I was too scared to leave home for a year, and I never did it. But I often think of that as sort of my one regret, and I just appreciate how much he believed in me and supported me. And when I finally went to Spain as an adult, I was like, oh man, would have been great to spend a year here in high school. But anyway, that's Mr. Conroy's story.
It's a beautiful story. What does it take to be a good professor in higher education in 2021?
I love that question. And in thinking about it, I am sure I'm sounding extremely old-fashioned, but my bottom line answer to that question is I think it takes the same things that it probably took in 1921, in terms of being a human being with your students. I think a successful teacher is organized. I think they're enthusiastic. I think they have high standards and clear expectations for their students, and are constantly open to negotiating those expectations based on particular circumstances that arise. You have to be flexible. Of course, in 2021, we have a whole lot of other things. Our students have a whole lot of other things to contend with, and we do too. Technology being one of them. And sort of the stresses that come along with the pace of what is possible with technology, and also the extreme trauma that can come with some of our technological engagement these days. So that piece is different. But I just think that modeling to your students your own humanity, your own curiosity, your own compassion, and being very willing, even if not at complete ease, with acknowledging when you're wrong, or changing course when something isn't working. And I know I taught high school before I taught university, and I know at both of those levels, we teachers don't like to admit we're wrong. But how can you possibly be right about everything? You can't. And I think it's really valuable and instructive to students when they see, like, oh, she doesn't know that either. That's good. I don't feel so, whatever, ignorant about it. And then you follow up and say, let's find out. That's a great question. How could we get the answer to that? And it becomes a collaboration in learning, rather than, you shutting down the question because you don't know the answer and you want to act like it's not important, or whatever your reaction might be. We've all seen those reactions. So those are some of the qualities I think are of value to have in 2021 and going forward.
Tell us a story about something creative you've done to engage your students.
Oh, I'm always trying to pull things out of my bag and put new tricks in the bag and get a different bag. And I'm a lit person, so I use metaphors a lot. But I'm going to tell you about one activity that I'm doing currently. And I'm telling you about this because I have done this in my face-to-face Indigenous women's class. This is a 4,000 level upper division class. It's cross-listed in American Indian Studies and History. And I teach it about every 2 years. This semester, I'm teaching it virtually, but in real time. So I am with my students, but online. So this project that we had done in the classroom actually it turns out has lended itself very well to being transferred online. And I call it the Indigenous Women's Film Fest. So what it is I I vet the movies. I select a number of documentaries. In this case, we're having 6 groups present. I think I put out 9 different documentaries and gave them some choice in what they are using. These are all documentaries that are available on one of our library databases. So it's not, they don't have to go searching around for these. I put a short description of each of the documentaries up on our Canvas site in the module with a link to the documentary so they can preview it a little bit if they want to. And then I let them I had them this time pick their top 3 choices in hopes that everyone could get at least one of those 3 choices. And then a few people said they didn't care, and that was helpful. So I was able to make groups up so that they had some choice about the documentaries that they wanted to do the presentation on, and work with some other people who also wanted to work on those. And then the ones who didn't care kindly went into whatever group needed a couple of extra people and hadn't chosen. But they do the presentation outside of class. They come up with some introductory questions. They preview the documentaries on their own. In the olden times, 2 years ago, my students would often get together for a kind of a screening together so they could watch it and then view. But this time, students watched it on their own, and then they got together virtually to talk about it, come up with some questions, create a Google Doc, whatever they chose to do about the actual lesson, do some introductory questions, and then their day to present, they open with their questions. I queue up the movie and I show it through the Canvas site on my end so that I have control over that. And then afterwards, the students have a question and answer period for the class so we can have a discussion about it. And they all seem to really enjoy that. Of course, the students who are presenting on a particular documentary, all the students enjoy seeing them all, but the ones who are presenting on the one that day, they get the most out of that one, of course, because they're asked to really engage with it and think about it and come up with questions. But as usual, I get students in all my American Indian Studies classes, so many of them say, like, how come we never learned about Wilma Mankiller? I'm a senior in college. I never even heard of these people. And I'm like, there's a reason for that, and it's a long story. But that's been something that's been fun. It's been a visual thing, so they can get a lot of content. 6 of our class periods this semester are those film fests, so they don't have to always be listening to me or, engaged in a discussion about the text, a written text. They can be engaged in a discussion about a visual text, and they're very visually oriented, as we know, and so I think that's a valuable tool for them to be able to kind of have some critical discussion in a class about those visual texts.
Thanks for sharing that story.
You're welcome.
Dr. Haladay, thank you for joining us today, and we appreciate what you've shared with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Hicks.
Thank you.